Hi, I'm Helen Perry from the Causeway and Glens Borough Council, and I'm the Museum Services Development Manager. I've worked with textiles all my life. I am not a conservator, but I've been fortunate enough to do a number of masterclasses, and that's why I'm here, just taking you through a very basic introduction to how you look after your textiles, particularly historic textiles. Very simply, all fabrics are textiles, generally speaking, but not all textiles are fabrics. And I'll give you an example. A carpet is a textile, not a fabric, because it's an end in itself. Fabrics tend to be used to be made up into something like a garment. Textiles are made with fibre or yarn, and there are four main sorts of fibres I'm going to talk to you about. There are plant-based fibres, and that's cotton and linen. Then there's animal-based fibres, which come from wool or silkworms. Then you get minerals such as glass or asbestos fibres. And then from the 1930s onwards in particular, you start to get the use of synthetic fibres such as nylon and polyester. Once you're progressing through the 20th century, you get complex compounds of natural and synthetic fibres. But we're going to focus on the sort of most common historic textiles that you may come across either within your community, in your own family. So what kinds of things do come in under textiles? Well, I've mentioned carpets. You will also have industrial textiles, and that might be, for instance, the linen that was used on aircraft wings. It might be the linen that's used on maps, the ropes that were used in shipbuilding. They're all textiles. You have medical textiles. If you think back to the early plaster casts, that's a textile-based, there's a textile backing on the plaster of Paris there, so complex, but there is a textile element to that. You've then got everything from uniforms, church vestments, church robes. You've got christening gowns and garments, including underwear. You've got toys, and I have here a lovely little bear that's in our collection. And of course you have household linens. You also have things like samplers, which were made by little girls practicing their needlework skills. So largely you get them from the 19th century, but there are earlier ones. We don't have any earlier ones in our collection. But you see the signs, and I think it's something when you're looking at textiles, you need to study that textile, because you're not just looking at a piece of linen, you're not just looking at a dress or a piece of underwear or a uniform. There will be stories embedded in those textiles, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, because when you're looking at what to do with your textile, you need to think about what's the story that's embedded here. So when we talk about the problems that you might come across, if you've found a big box of textiles in your attic, you may be aware of somebody who's got a whole pile of linen, or somebody who's offering you an historic dress. One of the most common problems are the moths and the clothes moths and their little grubs, and you will see traces, you'll see the little cocoon and the holes that the grubs create in clothes, and it's a common problem, we all have it. Another one, of course, is we're talking about textiles which are often being worn by people, so they've been in contact, they've picked up dust and dirt, mud, or worse. Dirt is a particular problem because when you look at the dirt under a microscope, they're incredibly sharp edges, so they can continue to damage our garment. Things like mould is another problem. If your garment has somehow come into contact with the rain, or it's just got damp because of the humidity. For instance, banners, which again are textiles with often a painted surface, which makes them a little bit trickier to look after. They've been out in parades, they've got wet, they've got perhaps soil on them, and they've been stored away without too much thought about getting them dry beforehand. So mould will build up on that. You also get mould because a lot of our household linens and a lot of our garments were starched. Those starches are generally a wheat or a grain-based stiffener, but that attracts moths and it also attracts moulds. You can see it on these household linens here, what happens over time when you've got a starched object in storage. Another problem are things like something we call fugitive dyes. Now, up until the middle of the 19th century, fugitive dyes were made from natural dyes, and they can fade, they can darken over time, and the worst thing, and one of the reasons conservators and would advise be really wary of earlier dyes because they will run. And actually you can see here that these dyes, somebody has thought to do the right thing and they have washed it, and they've also seem to have had it in the sun as well. So the thing has run and it's also faded. So fugitive dyes, just be very wary. Once you're getting into the sort of mid-1900s, you do see an introduction of the sort of chemical-based dyes that are much more stable, but just be wary. And I think if I can get one message across today is do not wash anything. Take advice first. Now we do also get physical damage, and that can be that there's a tear or a cut in a fabric. That can happen. And equally with some of the sort of precious silks that we have, because of the nature of extracting the silk from the little cocoon, it's a fairly harsh process. Silk is incredibly strong, but it does mean that if that hasn't been done to a high standard, it can create problems where the material basically just fractures and splits. Now, and you do see this often in church vestments and things, and there are ways of dealing with it. And that's where the conservators come in. It's a wonderful process to see some of these things come back to life through the work of a conservator and back into use and preserved for future generations. Any conservation is about stabilising an object. Any intervention is something that can be undone at any later stage. I mentioned before that if I can get one thing across is that please don't wash anything. Do not use modern soaps or detergents or dry cleaning. Our modern detergents have a lot of bleach and chemical agents in them which can stress out the fabric and cause further damage, let alone what it might do to the dyes that you have. Generally speaking, try not to iron it because, again, if you're putting pressure on delicate fabrics, it can just shred it. Don't store in an attic or a hot press. We do see textiles that have come out of attics because people have put them up there thinking they're safe, and the heat just causes all sorts of problems. Things dry out. If it's a damp space they've been put in, then you're into the molds, and potentially, if they haven't been kept under any sort of observation, you get your moths, and you can get worse. You can get your mice in there as well. Generally keep things away from sunlight. It will fade the colours, but equally it can damage the fibres. If you're mounting it, for instance, we took that sampler out of a frame because it was hard up against the glass. So if there's any fluctuation in humidity, it creates further damage. Don't put into direct contact with plastics either, for the reason where you can get condensation building up. Don't use any pins. A lot of military uniforms will have things like buckles, they'll have metal braids, they'll have badges with wee pins behind them. All of these can cause further damage, so do protect the actual textile from those objects. I'm not saying to remove them, but just wrap them up, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. Always use acid-free tissue. You can buy that quite easily online. And just support your garment when you're packing it. Don't pack it hard, don't put it under any pressure. Pack it out with acid-free tissue, and I'll show you how we might use something like bubble wrap or wadding to pad out with a layer of acid-free tissue between that and your garment. I mentioned earlier that conservators, any work that we do with our textiles should be reversible. It just means that, for instance, we don't use pens. If you're going to need to label your item, use a pencil. I would refer you to our other video, which looks at paper and photographs, where Sarah takes you through the basic cataloguing process. We would use lots of these little acid-free tags to put on objects with their unique number that takes you into the cataloguing system. The other thing we would use for small textile items that are single layers would be our Melanex pockets. If you are dealing with banners, flags, big flat single pieces of textiles like samplers, it may seem a little strange, but cardboard tubes can be your best friend, or a piece of plumbing pipe. However, you do not want this in contact with your textiles. They can be quite hard as well. So you want to soften this up and also create that neutral barrier. And it just is a good way. So I've got a pre-cut, this is like Blue Peter, I've got a pre-cut piece of bubble wrap. I'm just rolling it gently. This is not like wrapping a Christmas present. You do not want your thing to be trapped in here. You want it gently supported all the way through. So that can be quite a loose wrap. I'm just now going to roll that in a piece of acid-free tissue, and I would suggest you even use a couple of layers of acid-free tissue just to create something that enables you to wrap your textile around. If it's a carpet, if it's a banner that's been painted, you want that painted surface on the outside. Okay, so you've created a soft roll there that you can use then to support a textile. You need it to be bigger than the width of whatever it is you're rolling. And if it was a piece of carpet or a banner, if you place the banner face down, you may have seen garments in garment bags on coat hangers. What I would say is, if that's in a museum environment, that garment will have been assessed and conserved so that it can take the weight and the stress of being on a hanger. Generally speaking, you know, if something has come into your collection, like a beautiful evening dress, or particularly wedding dresses, often the necklines are quite delicate. So I would advise not to put them on a coat hanger. I would actually look at supporting it, and I'm going to show you with the uniform just some of the tricks to supporting your garment to put it away in a box rather than hang it, because it will stress particularly the neckline and the shoulders and damage your garment over time. Earlier I mentioned that one of the problems you can have is physical damage, and that physical damage can come from things like buttons and braids, wee buckles and pins. What I'm going to show you is, and it's the principle you'd use with other items of clothing. You can see at the moment it's just sitting flat, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open that up. I'm just going to show you how to just support a garment that you want to put away in some sort of storage box. So all I've done is taken a piece of bubble wrap. You can make it thicker, and I'm just enclosing it in my acid-free tissue, so there is a bit of a barrier. You can slip that in there and just let it close over that. You can put more layers in, so that's just giving it a little bit of protection there. What I'm next going to do is create what we very fondly call sausages to put up the sleeves. Have a look at what it is that you're looking to pad out, and just measure off the piece of bubble wrap that you want to use. You can use bubble wrap with the tissue paper to create all sorts of shapes and sizes to support things if you're worried about them. I'm just scrunching that loosely at the ends just to hold the bubble wrap in place. But you're basically taking that sausage and sliding it gently down the sleeve of the jacket. When we're working with uniforms, we quite often come across various badges, buttons. You can see how these have been attached at the back using these little pins, little metal pins with very, very sharp edges. So it would just be a good practice to try and slip a piece of tissue paper between that and the garment, just to stop any further catching or damage that they might do. Now I'm just going to show you what to do with the buttons. It's just taking little bits of tissue paper that have been cut, and all you're doing is just popping them around the button gently and squishing tissue paper in under it, just to give it, again, it's just giving that little bit of protection between the garment and potential sharp edges of buttons, and even if they're metal, any potential staining. I hope you found this helpful. It is just to give you a little introduction to looking after textiles. If you're looking for further information, by all means contact your local museums service. Up here in Northern Ireland, you can contact the Northern Ireland Museums Council. They have a list of conservators, as does the Irish Museums Association down south. So there are places to go to find help, and there are good guidance notes as well that are available on different sites. So please get in touch. You can contact me through CMS at causewaycoastandglens.gov.uk or find us on the website at www.niarchive.org.